I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome to RealAg on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM, 980 CGME. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. I hope you had yourself a great week. It is great to be with you here today. This is kind of a heavy news week. Lots happened, and we're going to break down in significance the biggest story of the week, which I think is Canada-India relations and what has happened there. And that's pretty important, especially in the province of Saskatchewan. Obviously, pulses, potash, those are two of the three largest exports out of Canada to India. Now, trade has not worked itself into this equation yet, but reasons for concern. We're going to hear a clip from RealAg Radio this week where our RealAg Issues Panel broke this down. Lindsay Smith, Kelvin Hepner, Olds farmer Jeff Nielsen. We'll hear that. And then we're going to hear from Neil Townsend of Grainfox. He's going to talk about the market impacts of what we have seen here. Also today, we're going to hear from Al Mussell of CAPI. New report out from CAPI talking about Canada's real lack of resilience when it comes to combating crises, especially when it comes to the value chain, the food chain, and logistical systems. So looking forward to hearing from Al on that. If you have any feedback on today's show, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or of course, you can always call that RealAg feedback line. It is 855-776-6147. Okay, let's talk Canada and India. This is from RealAg Radio on Friday's show, and this is the RealAg Issues Panel breaking down the situation between Canada and India. Enjoy. Kelvin, by all the events as far as what we know as of today, do you think Canada has handled this situation correctly up until this point, or what would be your evaluation?
I think it's tough to say. We're going to have to wait for more information. Of course, the Prime Minister chose to go out and announce in the House of Commons the news of what the Canadian government is calling, quote, credible allegations, directly linking India's government with the murder or even assassination of the Sikh separatist leader in Surrey, BC earlier this summer. And has been some reporting since then saying that there is actual evidence of Indian diplomats in Canada talking about this behind the scenes. So I think we need to wait and see how strong the evidence is before we can answer that question, Shaun, because we sure hope that the Prime Minister and the government has very extremely solid ground to go on before making these types of allegations against India, of course, a country that many other major countries and allies around the world are courting as a growing market and looking to make trade deals. In Canada itself, it's hard to believe how quickly things have deteriorated here. Basically, I saw one analyst yesterday say that the relationship is dead right now. It's just dead.
Dead.
And so, well, that was maybe a bit extreme, but it was just 2 months ago that officials from the Canadian government were talking to us about how they were hopeful that we would be able to reach a high-level trade deal known as an early progress trade agreement with India before the end of this calendar year. Well, now any trade deal with India is years, maybe even, I don't know, a decade away at best.
Yeah, and so just before we move on to the others, this is a Canadian citizen killed on Canadian soil. Correct?
But India calls him a terrorist because there is this movement among the Sikh population in India, and a lot of them have moved to Canada, that to create a separate state called Khalistan, carve it off of India. And so India's nationalist government, the Modi government, is quite nationalist, and so they view these people as they call them terrorists. And so it's and of course Canada has, just for context here, Canada has a huge Indian diaspora. Nearly 4% of Canadians are of Indian ethnic or cultural origin, and a large percentage of those are Sikh. So lots of different things to consider here.
Jeff, how worried does this make you? Just put your farmer hat on. Maybe it's an old wheat board hat, or maybe it's another one. how concerned are you about something like pulse exports being impacted?
I think though I don't grow pulses myself. It's been a challenging market for some time. They've been able to use probably some unfair trade barriers to limit our pulse imports into their country at times to support their farmers, which is what every country wants to do, support their own ag producers. But going forward, they are a country that continues to grow in population. They're a country that continues to need a reliable source for protein products, such as our pulses. So, and not just our pulses, they're actually needing some of our fertilizer too, like our potash too. So they are strong consumers of Canadian products, but can and will they use these as political tools in this latest dispute? That's the $1 million question or $1 billion question right now.
Yeah, a lot of money. It's a very, very much an appealing market to a lot of exporters, but there's that, and then there's also the geopolitical situation of these events as they're unfolding. So now, Lindsay, what's interesting is in Canada and in the U.S., when Canada and first broke, Prime Minister Trudeau first broke that they had this intelligence, went public with it, there was a lot of reporting that the UK, Australia, and especially the US were not exactly pleased with Canada. And I got some audio from yesterday. Now, this is the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, I should say, addressing this head on from a U.S. perspective. And I want to get your reaction, Lindsay. Here it is.
As soon as we heard from the Canadian Prime Minister publicly about the allegations, we went out publicly ourselves and expressed our deep concern about them, our support for a law enforcement process to get to the bottom of exactly what happened and to ensure that the perpetrators are held accountable. I'm not going to get into the substance of private diplomatic conversations, but we are in constant contact with our Canadian counterparts. We are consulting with them closely. We support the efforts that they are undertaking in this investigation, and we have also been in touch with the Indian government as well. And I will leave it at that for today, only to say that I have seen in the press some efforts to try to drive a wedge between the United States and Canada on this issue, and I firmly reject the idea that there is a wedge between the U.S. and Canada. We have deep concerns about the allegations, and we would like to see this investigation carried forward.
Now, Lindsay, does that give some temporary reprieve on criticism for the Prime Minister, or what? How do you interpret that?
Potentially, and I think what we have to recognize here as well is that we have heard that some of the intelligence that the Prime Minister and our intelligence community received was from outside of Canada. So part of, I believe it's called the Five Eyes Network. So other countries that we work with collectively on intelligence. So Canada is not alone in this per se, as far as the intelligence collection and where some of this information has come from. But I think that was definitely a very clear indication from the U.S. that this isn't at all a wedge between the two countries, that there will be cooperation on this intelligence side. And now, can you extrapolate that forward and say, the U.S. is going to help out Canada and punish India and something? Absolutely not. That's not nearly what we're even, I think, close to having a discussion on. But it does certainly, I think, back up that the intelligence and that the Prime Minister received and that has been brought to light is probably pretty solid, and that I do think it gives some credence to why going public with this, because that of course has been criticized. So I think actually the one we maybe should worry about, and maybe on a couple different fronts, is actually the UK. And if you think about our trade deals with the UK right now, we've got some friction there. The UK, of course, has very strong ties to India. It'll be interesting. I'm interested to see how that plays out and whether or not it creates frostier relationships with the UK.
That audio was from the RealAg Radio Issues Panel on Friday. Of course, you can get that show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for RealAg Radio. Okay, next we're going to continue with the discussion around India, but next we're going to talk to Neil Townsend. He is grain analyst with Grainfox. How can all of this impact the export of pulse crops? You're listening to Real Ag on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
You know, there's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup, weed control, field trial results, yield strategies, and so much more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF, Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from realagriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest podcast today.
Now that we set the stage on some of the geopolitical events in terms of the relationship between Canada and India, let's talk about the market reaction and what it could mean at the farm gate. Here's my conversation with Neil Townsend. He is market analyst with Grainfox.
Right now, the honest truth is we don't know if there's going to be some Indian retaliation along the food lines or particularly pulses. And when we talk about pulses, the big one is red lentils. That's about, close to a 600,000 ton export program from Canada to India last year. And then green lentils were around about 60,000 tons. So, call it 600 to 650,000 tons. Now, theoretically, India's a little tighter food, so maybe there was more upside this year, except for Canada grew a pretty small crop. So we're going to be limited in just how much we can send. But if it does spill over into that area, and again, it hasn't happened yet, I think that, we'd be concerned. We saw that with China and the Huawei CFO type of thing, and how, bad relations between the two countries at the top level can really have an impact on Western Canadian agriculture.
So, Neil, if there were possible trade restrictions in place on Canadian pulses by India, if they go that route, what are some of the impacts?
Well, I think if Canada is excluded from the market, if you just look at the world balance sheet for, say, red lentils or green lentils, they're relatively tight too. Australia is going to have a smaller crop. The U.S. is really not a red lentil producer. So, if Australia sort of eats our lunch because, India doesn't allow Canadian in there, there's going to be supposedly, wherever India would have shipped those to is going to be a market that's open for Canada. So, if you look at the zero-sum game, just because the particular supply and demand fundamentals right now, it doesn't look, it looks like we can accommodate a loss of the Indian market better this year than we could have in previous years, where we had a longer, bigger supply, where we would have had to build stocks in Canada. So, I think it's going to be adaptable. And the big thing is we don't want it to get to that level. Now, first of all, obviously, if another country's involved in assassinating a Canadian citizen, we can't abide that. That's not something that's good. So, we can argue about, money over morality all day long. But I just think the basic rule we'd like is that, hey, other countries don't come here and assassinate people, right? Yeah. The second thing, I would say is that India, when they make their policy around food, this is a real misapprehension, I think, by Canadian farmers. They never think about Canada. They're thinking about their internal market only, right? And they've got a very delicate balancing act to do. And the balancing act is between, urban dwellers who rely on cheap food to survive, and the rural population, which relies on, farm production to survive, right? So they have to balance those interests. And if you look at the weather patterns and some of the anecdotal evidence, you can't really rely on the statistics. One thing that's sort of clear is that at the most basic commodity level, there is a bit of struggle in India right now. They're short of rice, so they banned some rice exports. They're not necessarily as long as wheat as they want it to be, so they've been talking about wheat imports. Nothing's really materialized, but they've certainly said we're not exporting wheat. So, that all builds into their total food security. So I don't know if the Indian economy or the Indian government, it's very political. There's a big election in 2024. I don't know if they want to do something that would raise the domestic price of food. And by limiting the source of red lentils from, instead putting Canada out of the market and trying to rely on, Turkey and Australia and some of the other countries, I mean, that would raise the price of red lentils in India, which I'm not sure they want to do. Final thing I'll say is, I think a lot of times we think India or these countries, maybe they're not that good at international relations. India is very, very good at international relations. Like, they are literally surrounded by enemies, most specifically Pakistan. And, they know how to sort of like brinksmanship at something without actually, instigating a bigger, conflict. So I would say that maybe they're the ones to watch for leadership in this situation, where they'll sort of, certainly clock a protest against Canada so that everybody thinks, okay, Canada's not a good guy because they said this, but maybe in real terms, they won't do anything that's that significant. But I don't know, but I'm just saying, I think they're a very advanced, sophisticated international player when it comes to these types of things.
So from a Canadian farmer's perspective, maybe you have red lentils in the bin. What do you suggest that people do at this point? Is this a sell now, think later, or is this a hold pat and see how this plays out?
Well, again, we don't know the future. We don't know all of the implications and what's going to happen. But our strategy right now is don't chase the market down. Like, nothing has happened that has impacted that. We don't know. So, if you see the prices split 2 or 3 cents because somebody's out there saying, well, got to take some political risk, off the price, I wouldn't sell that. Now, prior to this happening, before we knew about the India conflict, I think red lentil prices had got to an attractive level to make a first sale to go to about 30% sold. And that's where we wanted to be positioned. But right now we've sort of shifted from, being active in the market, trying to advance sales, to what we call strategic inertia, meaning that, we're not going to sell into this environment. We're going to wait and cool down. And again, the one thing farmers need to remember, even if you had a good crop of red lentils and you're satisfied with your yield, and trust me, there's a lot of Canadian farmers who are not satisfied with their red lentil yield this past year. But even if you're in that situation, the whole context of red lentils within Canada is very tight, and the green lentils are even tighter. And then, Australia is still going to grow a big crop, but it's down almost 30% from last year. And they're right now facing their most adverse weather of the growing season, very hot temperatures and very dry there. So their yield may be going backward as well.
What signals are you looking for here, Neil, to give us an indication of the health or lack of health of this relationship from a trade perspective? We don't have weekly export sales reports like the U.S. does. So
right.
What are you following?
Well, I definitely look at like the CGC to see how that's happening. And then, monthly Statistics Canada puts out a better report that has, includes container shipments and the smaller batches that go out. I think most of the red lentils that would go to India would tend to go in sort of, some size of vessel, so they might be documented. So we're watching that. And Canada's actually off to like a fairly good start historically on the bulk shipment of lentils. So we've already done some. Again, it's periodic. And the bottom line is we just have such a tight supply that, it won't take too many bulk vessels to kind of, keep us ahead of pace. I mean, the exports, because of what we grew and because of the supply that came in, I mean, the exports have to be down by, 20, 25%. So, we're talking about a relatively small program. The other thing we're watching for, and again, is, we're right in the heart of it right now. Like, I mean, it's just happening. So I don't blame companies for taking a bit of cents off the, price per pound, bid or whatever. It's just that, like, let the dust settle a bit, see what's happening, and see if it does expand into something more. But right now, I don't think anybody really knows, except for maybe like an inner circle in India and maybe an inner circle in Canada, about what the next step here.
That was my conversation with Neil Townsend of Grainfox about the potential impacts here on the markets. With potash and red lentils being such large exports out of Canada to India, that may play very much into keeping this thing squashed a little bit, rolling into the trade arena. Coal as well, the number one export out of Canada into India. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more of Real Ag on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME right after this.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
The next generation is the future of agriculture, but how do we launch from one role to leading? From succession planning and family dynamics to understanding finances and making the tough calls to discovering paths others have taken all through agriculture, the Successors Podcast covers it all. Tune in with me, your host, Kara Oosterhuis, simply by searching The Successors on your favorite podcast platform, or you can find it by visiting www.realagriculture.com.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Let's now jump up to 100,000 feet or beyond and talk about a recent report that identifies Canada's real lack of a plan when it comes with dealing with crises. I'm joined right now by Al Mussell. He is Research Director with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, better known as CAPI. Al, how are we doing today?
Well, Shaun, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, I always enjoy our chats. New report out from CAPI. These are always interesting reports to dive into. It's entitled The Canadian Agri-Food Resilience, a Toolbox for Managing Crisis. So, Al, I guess first, what kind of crises are we talking about?
Well, crises are, I'll call it not small problems. The kind of things that are overwhelming, could be disastrous. Not the, maybe I'll respond in this way, Shaun. Not the sort of frictional risks that we are, I think, pretty well accustomed to dealing with in agriculture. Your market risks, most kinds of weather risks, disease risks, which are, somewhat individualized to the producer, let's say. We can handle those pretty well. Crises happen when you've got one risk that is, let's say a really large event that spills over into a bunch of other things and affects multiple levels simultaneously.
Historically, is Canada good at managing crises?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that. I mean, the big one sort of that comes to mind in my career is BSE, and obviously with some focus on Alberta, but of course a national event. And I'm going to say that that was one that we recognized the severity of it pretty quickly, and we acted very quickly to contain it. It's changed the face of the cattle industry forever and the beef industry. But I'm going to say that we probably actually managed that one pretty well, all things considered.
Al, what does your report recommend in this toolbox that we do differently than we have in the past?
Yeah, so we don't really have a set of tools. Whether you want to look at our BRM suite, you want to look at agri-recovery. It doesn't really contemplate this problem of converging crises where you got a big problem that sort of spills over and leads to a whole bunch of other things. And it's kind of, you thought that the risk that you had on the table was X, and then that converges into something much larger than X, and like, gosh, how did we get to this place? I'll give you an example that may be intuitive to some of your listeners, Shaun, and this comes from a very credible source. I was watching the Today Show on NBC a few weeks ago, And
Al,
they're
you know what? I'm surprised. I thought you were more of a View sort of guy, but I guess we'll stick with the
yeah,
CHO.
maybe I need to start into the View. But you know, so I've turn on the TV and they're interviewing this couple that lives in Florida, and they're talking about how their insurance company has canceled their property insurance coverage. And they go on and say, well, actually, if I understand this correctly, all of the big insurance companies have abandoned the Florida market for property insurance. Now you can imagine that's a massive financial issue. Now apparently the state of Florida operates sort of a state-run property insurance that you can't be denied for. But you know, and of course the rationale for this is hurricanes, and the prospect that the hurricanes are becoming more frequent, more severe, and insurance companies are sort of saying, look, how do we offer insurance for this marketplace and either make it affordable for people or manage to provide the coverage that's meaningful? Can't do it. Okay, we're out of here. And my understanding from the story in the Today Show is that's exactly what's happened. But you can see how something like that, you know, what's a rational reaction? People say, well, look, I can't get proper insurance for my property in Florida. Guess what? I'm leaving Florida. So you start to see property being liquidated. What happens then? Prices start to go down. Other people say, well, hang on. All of my wealth is tied up in my property, my home, etc. I'm out of here too. And you begin to see how, you know, that's a sort of an extreme weather plows into an insurance crisis, which then leads to a financial crisis. And of course, when you're looking at the finances in the United States, Florida is not a small part. It's significant. You know, these are, and so that's one that's occurring in real time. You know, you bring it back to our context in agriculture. It's not a real big stretch to say that, you know, I'm not saying this will happen, but using my imagination could happen with crop insurance, right?
Mm.
You know, you've got certain areas where crop insurance, like, you know, what's holding up your land values? Well, it's crop insurance. If we get a sequence of years, very bad years, and you know, you go back and say, well, look, we have to run crop insurance and BRM instruments like it in a certain way. It's got to be profitable. It's got to have premium levels that are affordable for people, and it has to have meaningful coverage for them. If we can't, you know, manage to meet those three conditions, then we can't offer this. And this then spills over into a bunch of other things that are in principle unanticipated by a problem with insurance, which many people would view as kind of a technical financial issue.
In the report, Al, one of the points made, I was going to say criticisms, but I'm not sure that's exactly fair, but just points of significance. And it's key takeaway point number one, actually. Maybe I should have started there. The lack of a long-term vision for the Canadian agri-food sector constrains effective research, strategy, and analysis. So is the idea there that because we don't actually have a long-term vision of what we're actually striving for, it's really hard to know what potential roadblocks are in front of us, to know what some of our reactive strategies need to be to some of those roadblocks? Is that what's at play here? Or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Another aspect is how the pieces connect together and the assumptions that you make about them.
Oh.
So for example, we have a BRM program suite, which, you know, I might add, I think for the most part has actually worked pretty well for us. But you know, it's sort of assuming that you know, perils will come, people will suffer, but you know, within the course of about 3 years, this will, you know, basically correct itself back to normal. So either you know, if it's you as an individual that have had an isolated event that you have to deal with, you know, we can get you back on your feet again and more or less back to normal within 3 years. Because after 3 years, of course, if we're talking about agri stability, you start to lose your reference margin, right? Similarly with market conditions. So we can have a bad year, but we're not going to have 3 bad years in a row, such that we start to lose our reference. These are the assumptions that work into the program, and you know, for the most part, that's worked out okay. But, when you start to think about a world where we have a bunch of new perils that we're not accustomed to thinking about. So, extreme weather is one of them. The decline of the multilateral rules-based trade system and the geopolitical, perhaps willingness to use food as a weapon that go with that. Some of the other sort of big picture sweeping changes that we face today. It's not as clear that 3-year window or even a 5-year window really is enough to think through what happens, because the reality is we like to think of the world, and I'll be honest with you, economists are among the worst of them. Is everything, we have a disturbance, and then it reverts back to the average situation. And that's what we're always doing. We're always sort of bringing things back to this long-term average. We correct for these disturbances. But actually, when you deal with some of these potentially big, ugly disruptions, you never get back to the average. It's sort of a dynamic in which things can sort of spin out of control, and you may get to some new stable point, but it's not the one you're at before. And again, thankfully, we haven't seen that, but I worry that we may have been lucky.
We're going to have more of my discussion with Al Mussell of Cappy when we come back. You're listening to Real Ag on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith of RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern for The Agronomists, Canada's only live, interactive, agronomy-based show. Each week, we answer your most pressing questions with a rotating panel of agronomists, researchers, and extension staff from across Canada. Join me Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, or head to realagriculture.com/live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year, on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by Pride Seeds, BASF, and Syngenta Canada.
We're talking to Al Mussell of Cappy about Canada's need to have a plan dealing with crises. 5 key takeaways. You just made me think of point number 5. Okay, I'm just going to read it out and I want you to comment on it. Sure. Agri-food policy in Canada has typically seen supply chain vulnerabilities as a transactional event, or as transactional events that can be contained and managed within the impacted value chain. This is inconsistent with the risks of converging crises and the unique role of the food supply chain, and there is an opportunity and need to move beyond existing approaches. Talk about that point.
Right, sure. So let me just give you an example. So you have a crisis in the pig industry, big picture crisis. Well, it could be African swine fever. African swine fever, and I think everybody at least connected to the swine industry is aware that this is like an existential threat. Okay, so this could change if we were to have that occur with us, then that could change structurally and probably almost permanently the size and scope of the pig industry in Canada. However, there's supply segments that are connected to that. So your feed grain segment, for example. How does this begin to affect the basis in different parts of the country? Could be barley, could be wheat shorts, could be corn. How does it begin to affect that marketplace? Then in turn, how does this affect the choice of crops that we grow going forward in the future if we don't have a feed market from pigs? There's this sense that we always have that, there's a animal disease, it's a bad animal disease, but we're going to pour the resources in there and we're going to get that corrected. And everybody is, there's going to be some bad hurt, but ultimately we're going to make everybody whole and we'll more or less return back to the way that we were. I don't think African swine fever shapes up that way. And there's a number of other perils in the world that don't either.
I don't know if your scope of your work here look beyond our borders, but are we just like other countries in this regard, or are we actually better than others, although we have some critiques, or are we really, really a laggard here when it comes to our preparedness for these sorts of issues?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm quite qualified to answer the question, Sean. Let's take a look at the U.S. In their ag policy programming suite, this is primarily commodity based. It's evolved a bit. Now we have, I guess I need to update that a little bit. We've got all kinds of money for sustainable agriculture. We got money for small packing plants. We got lots on the table that is different than what we've had historically. But if you look at sort of the real wheelhouse on the U.S. ag programming suite, it's commodity based programming. So you're trying to use deficiency payments to put a floor on the producer's returns from those individual crops. Does it deal with situations like this? I'm going to say no. It probably deals real well with I should maybe paraphrase that a little bit. It's still commodity-based ag policy, which is generally harmful to us, so we don't appreciate that part much. But it's a little bit like our ag policy, our BRM suite, in the sense that it deals, I think, pretty well with let's say the 5% deviation, the 8% deviation in terms of getting people been knocked down, you get them stood back up on their feet and help them back, and in a short period of time, they're more or less back to normal. That's the 5 to 8% hit. The 30% hit, I don't think we have a solution for.
My estimation here, my guess is that if we were coming up with the toolbox and thinking about this visionary kind of plan for where we're going and all the different barriers and the possibilities that will stand in front of us or create this chaos in what we're trying to accomplish. If you were doing that for the airline sector, or you were doing it for the auto sector, it's a lot easier. One of the challenges we have is that there's so much diversity in our sector from a production standpoint, size of producer, type of commodities produced, end use markets, that that diversity creates this level of complexity that really prevents us from actually figuring our stuff out to move forward together on some sort of plan and putting this toolbox together. Is that fair and accurate?
Yeah, I think it's a good observation, Sean. The thing that I'll add to that is, farmers are used to struggle, and they struggle. The auto sector, the airlines, I think they're not making any money. They kind of quit. And so the service stops, the product flow stops. Farmers are different. They struggle to try and adapt. They try to keep going and hopefully don't go broke in the process, but that happens too. So in a strange way, I think that maybe makes it more difficult. But yeah, it's just it's so interconnected. There's you're dealing with biology, you're dealing with economics, you're dealing with finance, you're dealing with international relationships, treaties, trade policy, all that kind of thing.
Al, great stuff. If somebody wants access to the report, go to the CAPI website.
Yes, absolutely. It's there. Okay,
so that is capi-icpa.ca. So just type in CAPI and Al Mussell, and it's bound to show up for sure. Hey, Al, thanks for joining us so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Sean.
Talked about some real heavy issues here today on Real Ag on the Weekend. If you have any feedback, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Or, of course, you can find us across all the different social media platforms. Go to realagriculture.com to read up more on these stories and more. Or, of course, call the Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. Have yourselves a great rest of your weekend, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for Real Ag on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME.